On a warm August day in 1919, as Europe was still counting the dead from the Great War, Johannes Adrianus Joseph Verleun was born into a world where faith provided both comfort and direction. His parents, Johannes Adrianus Verleun and Adriana Cornelia Rikers, welcomed their third child in a modest home at 36 Admiral de Ruitenweg in Amsterdam, directly across from the towering Boomkerk. The location was no accident. In this deeply Catholic household, the church bells that rang throughout each day would become the soundtrack of young John's childhood. The Verleun family embodied the traditional Catholic values that still dominated much of Dutch society in the early 20th century. Johannes Sr. worked as a subdriver, a steady if modest profession that supported what would eventually become a family of 10 children. Adriana Cornelia managed the household with the firm hand and deep devotion typical of Catholic mothers of her generation. Theirs was a world where Sunday Mass was non-negotiable, where prayers punctuated daily meals, and where the local parish priest commanded respect second only to God himself. Jan grew up surrounded by the rituals and rhythms of Catholic life. The Boomkerk across the street was more than just a building. It was the spiritual center that organized the family's entire existence. Morning prayers, evening rosaries, feast day celebrations, and the solemn observances of Lent created a calendar that young Jan learned to navigate before he could properly read. In this environment, religious devotion was not just encouraged but expected, woven into the fabric of daily life as naturally as breathing. The Amsterdam of John's childhood was a city still finding its footing after the devastation of the Great War. Though the Netherlands had remained neutral during the conflict, the economic and social upheaval that followed affected every aspect of Dutch life. Traditional institutions like the Catholic Church provided stability and meaning in uncertain times. For families like the Verleuns, faith offered both explanation for hardship and hope for better days ahead. As the third of what would become 10 children, Jan learned early the importance of responsibility and sacrifice. In large Catholic families of this era, older children were expected to help care for younger siblings, and resources were always stretched thin. Yet the Verleun household was marked not by complaint, but by acceptance. This was God's plan, and their role was to embrace it with grace and gratitude. Jan's earliest years passed in the predictable pattern of Catholic family life. He attended the local parish school, where Jesuit priests provided education that seamlessly blended academic learning with religious instruction. The Jesuits, with their emphasis on intellectual rigor and spiritual discipline, represented the pinnacle of Catholic education in the Netherlands. For a bright boy from a devout family, their influence was profound and lasting. It was at the age of 9 that Jan experienced what would later seem like a moment of divine calling. Exactly what prompted his decision to become a priest remains unknown, but the resolve was absolute and unshakable. Perhaps it was the daily example of the Jesuit teachers who combined learning with devotion. Perhaps it was the influence of the local parish priest who visited the Verleun home regularly. Or perhaps it was simply the natural progression for a sensitive, intelligent boy, raised in an environment where serving God was considered the highest possible calling. Whatever the source, Jan's announcement that he intended to join the priesthood was met with joy and pride by his parents. In Dutch Catholic culture of the 1920s and 30s, having a son enter the priesthood was considered one of the greatest honors a family could achieve. It meant that their devotion had been recognized by God himself, that they had raised a child worthy of serving at the altar. Jan's academic performance at the Jesuit parish school in Amsterdam South reinforced his family's belief in his calling. He excelled in his studies, showing particular aptitude for theology and languages. The priests who taught him noted his serious demeanor and genuine piety. Unlike many boys his age who paid lip service to religious obligations, Jan seemed to truly embrace the spiritual life with an intensity that impressed even his Jesuit instructors. After completing the 7th grade, Jan's path toward the priesthood took its next logical step. He was accepted to the seminary at Sint-Udenrode, a small town in North Brabant that housed one of the most respected Catholic seminaries in the Netherlands. For 13-year-old Jan, leaving Amsterdam for the cloistered world of the seminary represented both the fulfillment of his childhood dream and the beginning of serious preparation for a life dedicated to God. The seminary at Sint-Udenrode was a world apart from the bustling streets of Amsterdam. Here, dozens of young men from across the Netherlands gathered to begin their journey toward ordination. The daily schedule was rigorous and unforgiving. Early morning prayers, Latin lessons, theological study, more prayers, simple meals taken in silence, and evening devotions before bed. It was a life designed to strip away worldly concerns and focus entirely on spiritual development. For 3 years, Jan thrived in this environment. He embraced the discipline, excelled in his studies, and seemed to embody everything the seminary sought to develop in future priests. His fellow seminarians respected his dedication, and his instructors noted his progress with approval. Everything seemed to be proceeding exactly as Jan and his family had always expected. Then, without warning or explanation, everything changed. In Jan's 3rd year at the seminary, the rector called him aside for a private meeting. The conversation was brief and devastating. Jan would not be continuing his studies for the priesthood. The reasons, the rector explained, were matters of institutional judgment that would not be discussed further. Jan was simply not suited for ordination. The rejection was as mysterious as it was final. No specific failings were cited, no particular incidents referenced, no opportunity for appeal or reconsideration offered. The decision had been made, and Jan's childhood dream was over. The seminary that had been his whole world for 3 years suddenly became a place where he no longer belonged. At 16, Jan returned to Amsterdam a changed person. The confident boy who had left for the seminary had been replaced by a young man grappling with questions that had no easy answers. If God had called him to the priesthood at age 9, why had that calling been rejected at 16? What did this mean for his faith, his future, his understanding of divine will? Back in the family home on Admiral de Ruyterweg, Jan resumed his studies, preparing for his final examinations through private tutoring and self-directed learning. His parents, devastated by their son's rejection from the seminary, nevertheless maintained their faith that God had a plan, even if that plan was not immediately clear. The family rallied around Jan, providing the support and love he needed during this difficult transition. Yet questions lingered in the household across from the Boomkerk. What had the seminary seen in Jan that his family had missed? What hidden flaw had disqualified him from service to God? The mystery of his rejection would never be fully explained, leaving a wound that would influence everything that followed in Jan's life. As Jan approached his 17th birthday in 1936, the world around him was beginning to change in ways that would soon make his personal struggles seem small by comparison. For across the border in Germany, a failed artist named Adolf Hitler was consolidating power and preparing for a war that would test the faith and courage of every person in Europe. The peaceful world of Jan Verleun's youth shattered at precisely 5:30 in the morning on May 10, 1940. German bombers roared across the Dutch border, their engines drowning out the familiar church bells that had marked time throughout Jan's childhood. Operation Fall Gelb, Hitler's assault on Western Europe, had begun, and the Netherlands found itself thrust into a war it had desperately tried to avoid. At 20 years old, Jan was no longer the confused teenager who had returned from seminary 4 years earlier. He had completed his education, found his footing in civilian life, and accepted that his path would not lead to the priesthood. Like thousands of young Dutchmen, he had been called up for military service as tensions across Europe escalated throughout the late 1930s. The Dutch government, hoping to maintain the neutrality that had served the country well during the Great War, nevertheless understood the need to prepare for the possibility of conflict. The Netherlands in 1940 was a nation caught between hope and reality. Queen Wilhelmina and her government clung to the belief that Dutch neutrality would be respected as it had been from 1914 to 1918. The country's strategic position, however, made it an inevitable target for German military planners who needed quick access to the English Channel and the ports that could threaten British supply lines. When the German assault began, the Dutch military found itself facing an enemy that had already conquered Poland and was employing revolutionary tactics that combined air power, armor, and rapid infantry advances. The Luftwaffe's destruction of Dutch airfields in the opening hours of the invasion eliminated much of the country's ability to resist from the air. German paratroopers seized key bridges and strategic points, while armored columns pushed across the eastern border with overwhelming force. Jan's unit was among those rushed to defensive positions as the German advance gathered momentum. The Dutch military, though brave and determined, was simply outmatched by the scale and sophistication of the German war machine. Modern Wehrmacht tactics, refined during the Polish campaign, proved devastatingly effective against Dutch forces that were still organized around concepts from the previous war. For young men like Jan, who had grown up in peaceful Amsterdam, the reality of modern warfare came as a profound shock. The seminary had prepared him for spiritual battles against sin and temptation, but nothing in his experience had readied him for the mechanized violence that German forces brought to the Netherlands. The sound of artillery, the sight of burning buildings, and the chaos of retreat created a new world that bore no resemblance to anything he had known. It was during one of these early engagements, as Dutch forces attempted to slow the German advance, that Jan experienced the event that would define the rest of his life. His unit had taken up positions along a river, hoping to prevent German forces from crossing and continuing their push toward the major cities of Western Netherlands. The plan was simple: hold the line long enough for other Dutch units to organize a more effective defense. The Germans, however, had no intention of being delayed by hastily prepared river defenses. As Jan and his comrades watched from their positions, German soldiers began preparing to cross the water using rubber boats. The sight of the enemy preparing to outflank their position spurred Jan to action. Taking careful aim with his rifle, he fired at the lead boat, hoping to puncture the rubber and send its occupants into the cold water. The bullet struck the boat, but bounced harmlessly off its reinforced surface. The Germans had anticipated such defensive measures and equipped their crossing equipment accordingly. Almost immediately, return fire erupted from the German positions. Jan felt a tremendous impact in his upper arm, followed by a sensation of wetness spreading down his sleeve. Looking down, he saw blood flowing freely from a wound that seemed to pulse with each heartbeat. The amount of blood loss was alarming, and Jan quickly realized he was in serious danger. The bullet had torn through muscle and possibly damaged major blood vessels in his arm. As his strength began to ebb and consciousness started to fade, Jan experienced what he would later describe as a moment of absolute clarity. Faced with what he believed was impending death, the young man who had once sought to serve God in the priesthood made a new and equally profound vow. In that moment of crisis, Jan promised God that if he survived his wounds, he would dedicate his life to freeing the Netherlands from German occupation. It was a vow as serious and binding as any he might have made during ordination, spoken not in the peaceful sanctuary of a church, but amid the chaos and violence of a battlefield. The rejected seminarian had found a new calling, one that would demand even greater sacrifice than the priesthood he had been denied. Jan's comrades, seeing their wounded companion, quickly organized his evacuation from the defensive position. They bound his arm as best they could with field dressings, stemming the flow of blood enough to buy time for proper medical attention. A local cart driver, risking his own safety to help wounded Dutch soldiers, loaded Jan onto his horse-drawn wagon and transported him to the hospital in Arnhem. The journey to Arnhem took several hours, during which Jan drifted in and out of consciousness. The cart driver, an older man who had lived through the previous war, offered what comfort he could, speaking quietly about better days ahead and the importance of faith during dark times. For Jan, these words reinforced his conviction that surviving his wound was part of a divine plan that he was only beginning to understand. At the hospital in Arnhem, Dutch medical staff worked frantically to treat the flood of wounded soldiers arriving from the collapsing front lines. Jan's wound, while serious, was not life-threatening if properly treated. The bullet had missed major arteries, and skilled surgeons were able to repair the damage and stop the bleeding. But recovery would take weeks, time that Jan would spend reflecting on his experience and the vow he had made. During his weeks in the hospital, Jan witnessed the complete collapse of Dutch resistance. On May 14th, just 4 days after the invasion began, German bombers destroyed the center of Rotterdam, killing hundreds of civilians and demonstrating the futility of continued resistance. Queen Wilhelmina and her government fled to London, and General Henry Winkelmann surrendered Dutch forces to prevent further destruction of Dutch cities. The Netherlands, which had remained free during 4 years of the Great War, had fallen to German forces in just 5 days. For Jan and millions of other Dutch citizens, the swift defeat marked the beginning of an occupation that would test every aspect of their national character and personal faith. The country that had prided itself on neutrality and peaceful commerce was now part of Hitler's expanding empire. As Jan's arm healed and his strength returned, he had ample time to consider what his vow to God actually meant in practical terms. The professional Dutch military had been defeated and disbanded. The government had fled into exile. German administrators were taking control of every aspect of Dutch society. How could one young man with a wounded arm possibly contribute to liberating his country from such overwhelming occupation forces? The answer came during his train journey back to Amsterdam. Still wearing a bandage on his arm and moving carefully to avoid aggravating his healing wound, Jan encountered a fellow passenger who would change the trajectory of his life. The man introduced himself as Pam, though Jan would later learn his full name was Petrus Antonius Martinus Pooters. Pam had also fought during the brief campaign, serving at the Grebbeberg, and like Jan, he had survived the defeat with questions about what came next. Unlike Jan, however, Pam had already found his answer. He had made contact with a group of like-minded Dutch citizens who refused to accept German occupation as permanent. These men and women were organizing resistance activities, working to undermine German authority and maintain Dutch independence in whatever ways possible. The defeat of the regular army, Pam explained, did not mean the end of Dutch resistance. During their conversation, Pam assessed Jan's character and commitment. The young man's obvious anger at the German occupation, combined with his military experience and evident intelligence, marked him as a potential recruit for resistance work. Before their train reached Amsterdam, Pam had made Jan an offer that would fulfill his battlefield vow in ways he had never imagined. Pam reached into his coat and produced a small air pistol, placing it carefully in Jan's hands. It was not much of a weapon by military standards, but it represented something far more significant than its modest appearance suggested. This pistol was an invitation to join a secret war that would be fought not by armies in uniform, but by ordinary citizens willing to risk everything for their country's freedom. As the train pulled into Amsterdam's central station, Jan stepped onto the platform carrying more than just his personal belongings and a healing wound. He carried the first weapon of what would become a deadly arsenal, and his transformation from rejected seminarian to resistance fighter had officially begun. The address at Karelstraat 6 in Amsterdam appeared unremarkable from the outside, just another narrow townhouse in a city full of similar structures. But for Jan Verleun and dozens of other young Dutch men and women, this modest building would become a different kind of seminary, one that taught lessons far removed from Latin prayers and theological doctrine. Here, under the guidance of the Boissevin brothers, Jan would receive an education in the deadly arts of resistance warfare. Gideon and Jan Karel Boissevin, known to his friends as Janka, came from a prominent Dutch family with deep roots in Amsterdam's intellectual and business communities. Their father had been a successful banker, and the brothers themselves had enjoyed privileged educations and comfortable lives before the German occupation changed everything. Like many members of the Dutch upper class, they could have accommodated themselves to German rule and maintained their social positions. Instead, they chose resistance. The Boissevin brothers founded CS6 during the summer of 1940, taking their group's name from the street address where they established their headquarters. Their approach to resistance was methodical and professional, reflecting their business backgrounds and the analytical thinking that came from their privileged educations. They understood that effective resistance required more than patriotic enthusiasm. It demanded careful planning, reliable funding, and skilled operatives who could carry out complex missions without being detected by German security forces. When Pam Pooters brought Jan to the Karelstraat 6 headquarters in late 1940, the young man encountered an organization unlike anything he had experienced during his military service or seminary education. CS6 operated more like a revolutionary cell than a traditional military unit, with compartmentalized information, coded communications, and elaborate security procedures designed to protect members from German infiltration. Jan's first instructor in the underground seminary was the group's technical specialist, a quiet man who taught the practical skills that resistance work required. Jan learned to file bullets by hand, carefully shaping each piece of ammunition to ensure maximum effectiveness when fired from the group's collection of pistols and rifles. The work was painstaking and dangerous, requiring steady hands and absolute concentration. A poorly filed bullet could jam a weapon at the worst possible moment, potentially costing an operative his life. More complex was the training in explosives handling. Jan learned to attach electrical wires to dynamite charges, creating timing devices that could detonate explosives minutes or hours after placement. The science behind these devices was straightforward, but the practical application required nerves of steel and meticulous attention to detail. A single mistake in wiring could cause premature detonation, killing the person placing the charge and potentially exposing the entire operation. Document forgery represented another crucial skill in the resistance curriculum. Jan studied the techniques needed to alter identification cards, travel permits, and ration books that could mean the difference between life and death for resistance members and the people they sought to protect. The work required artistic ability, patience, and an intimate knowledge of German bureaucratic procedures. Jan learned to recognize the subtle differences between legitimate stamps and amateur forgeries, understanding that German security services were constantly improving their ability to detect false documents. Beyond technical training, Jan received education in operational security that would have impressed his former Jesuit instructors with its thoroughness and discipline. He learned to vary his routes through Amsterdam, to recognize surveillance, and to communicate through coded messages that appeared to be innocent correspondence between friends or family members. Every aspect of resistance work, from meeting locations to weapon storage, was governed by elaborate protocols designed to minimize the risk of detection and capture. The group's activities during 1941 and early 1942 focused primarily on sabotage operations designed to disrupt German administration and undermine occupation authority. Jan participated in attacks on distribution offices where Germans controlled the allocation of food and essential supplies to Dutch civilians. These raids served multiple purposes. They destroyed German records, provided resistance groups with supplies they needed, and demonstrated to ordinary Dutch citizens that organized opposition to the occupation was possible. railway attacks represented some of CS6's most dangerous and important work. The German war effort depended heavily on rail transportation to move troops, supplies, and stolen Dutch resources back to Germany. Jan learned to place explosive charges on railway lines, timing the detonations to cause maximum disruption while minimizing the risk of civilian casualties. The work required careful reconnaissance, precise timing, and quick escape routes that could be executed even in darkness. One of Jan's most significant early operations involved the Rembrandt Theater, where German propaganda films were shown to audiences that included both German soldiers and Dutch collaborators. The theater had become a symbol of cultural submission to German occupation, showing movies that promoted Nazi ideology and minimized the brutality of German rule. CS6's decision to target the building reflected their understanding that resistance involved more than military action. It required challenging German efforts to control Dutch hearts and minds. The attack on the Rembrandt Theater required weeks of careful planning. Jan and his fellow operatives studied the building's layout, identified the best locations for incendiary devices, and planned escape routes that would allow them to disappear into Amsterdam's maze of streets and canals before German security forces could respond. The successful fire that gutted much of the theater sent a clear message to both Germans and Dutch collaborators that resistance groups possessed both the capability and determination to strike at targets throughout occupied territory. CS6 also attempted to destroy the Hollandsche Schouwburg, another venue that Germans used for propaganda purposes. Though this operation was less successful than the Rembrandt Theater attack, it demonstrated the group's willingness to take significant risks in pursuit of their goals. Jan's participation in these operations marked his evolution from a novice recruit carrying an air pistol to a skilled operative capable of planning and executing complex sabotage missions. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of CS6's work involved helping Jews and other targets of German persecution to hide or escape from occupied territory. This activity required a completely different set of skills than sabotage operations. Instead of destroying German property, resistance members had to create false identities, establish safe houses, and maintain supply networks that could support people in hiding for months or years. Jan's Catholic background proved valuable in this work, as many Dutch churches and religious communities were willing to provide assistance to Jews seeking to escape German persecution. His seminary education had given him connections within Amsterdam's Catholic community that other resistance members lacked. Priests and nuns who remembered the serious young man from the Verleun family were often willing to help when Jan approached them about hiding people or providing false documents. The work of protecting Jews and other fugitives also brought Jan into contact with resistance networks beyond CS6. He collaborated with the group led by Gerrit Jan van der Veen, which specialized in producing false identification documents of exceptional quality. These partnerships demonstrated how different resistance organizations were beginning to coordinate their activities, sharing resources and expertise to maximize their effectiveness against German occupation forces. As 1942 progressed into 1943, CS6's leadership began discussing more ambitious operations than sabotage and rescue work. The Boissevin brothers understood that resistance groups needed to demonstrate their capability to strike at high-value targets if they hoped to inspire broader Dutch opposition to German rule. Attacking theaters and railway lines was important, but eliminating key figures in the German administration or Dutch collaboration would send a much more powerful message. The group's discussions about assassination reflected a fundamental shift in Jan's understanding of his role as a resistance fighter. The seminary had taught him that taking human life was one of the gravest sins possible, a violation of divine commandment that could damn a soul for eternity. His battlefield vow to God, however, had committed him to doing whatever was necessary to free the Netherlands from German occupation. As CS6 moved toward planning assassination operations, Jan faced the same kind of moral crisis that had challenged him when the seminary rejected his calling to the priesthood. The target that emerged from CS6's strategic planning was General Hendrik Seyfarth, a former Dutch military officer who had agreed to work with German occupation forces. Seyfarth's collaboration with the Germans made him a traitor in the eyes of most Dutch citizens, but his assassination would require CS6 to cross a line that separated sabotage from murder. For Jan, the decision to participate in killing Seyfarth represented the final step in his transformation from rejected seminarian to resistance assassin. The planning for Seyfarth's assassination would test everything Jan had learned during his years in the underground seminary, and the operation's success would mark his emergence as one of the most dangerous men in occupied Netherlands. The announcement appeared in Dutch newspapers on February 4, 1943, buried among routine administrative notices that most readers skipped entirely. Retired General Hendrik Seyfarth, already head of the Dutch SS volunteer group Vrijwilligers Legio in Nederland, had been appointed as Deputy for Special Services in Anton Musert's new shadow cabinet. To casual observers, it seemed like another bureaucratic shuffle in the complex machinery of German occupation. To the leadership of CS6, it represented a declaration of war that demanded immediate response. Seyfarth's appointment was far more significant than the bland newspaper language suggested. The former Dutch general had become the most visible symbol of military collaboration with German forces, using his reputation and authority to recruit Dutch volunteers for service on the Eastern Front. His new position would give him unprecedented power to organize Dutch manpower for German military purposes, potentially leading to the conscription of thousands of young Dutch men to fight and die for Nazi Germany. The Boissevin brothers called an emergency meeting at the Corellestraat 6 headquarters to assess this development. Present were the core members of CS6, including Jan Verleun, whose skills and dedication had earned him a place among the group's most trusted operatives. The discussion that followed would mark a turning point not just for CS6, but for the entire Dutch resistance movement. Gerrit Castijn, the communist surgeon who had become one of CS6's key strategic thinkers, presented the case for immediate action. Seyfarth's appointment, he argued, was part of a larger German plan to transform the Netherlands into a fully integrated component of the Nazi war machine. Allowing him to organize systematic recruitment of Dutch soldiers would strengthen German forces while draining the Netherlands of the young men who might otherwise join resistance movements. The strategic analysis was compelling, but the implications were sobering. Assassinating Seyfarth would require CS6 to cross the line from sabotage to targeted killing, transforming the organization from urban guerrillas into an assassination squad. The decision would make every member a marked man, subject to execution if captured by German security forces. For Jan, the discussion echoed the theological debates he had encountered during his seminary years, but with stakes that were immediate and deadly. The moral questions were complex. Was killing a collaborator murder or patriotic duty? Did the potential to save thousands of Dutch lives justify taking one life? Could a man serve God by becoming an executioner? The group's analysis of potential targets focused on accessibility and symbolic impact. Anton Mussert, the leader of the Dutch National Socialist movement, was the most obvious choice, but also the most heavily protected. German security services understood his importance and surrounded him with elaborate protective measures that made assassination nearly impossible. Seyfarth, by contrast, maintained a more typical lifestyle, living in a private residence without the military-level security that protected higher-ranking German officials. After hours of debate, CS6 reached its fateful decision. Seyfarth would die, and the operation would be carried out by the organization's most skilled and reliable operatives. Jan Verleun and Gerrit Castijn received the assignment that would transform them from resistance fighters into assassins. fulfilling Jan's battlefield vow in ways he had never imagined when he made that desperate promise to God. The planning phase consumed several weeks of careful reconnaissance and preparation. Jan and Castijn studied Seyfart's daily routines, mapping his movements between his home at 36 Van Nekstraat in Scheveningen and his various appointments throughout The Hague. They identified the optimal time and location for the attack, balancing accessibility against the risk of civilian casualties and the likelihood of escape. The evening of February 5th presented ideal conditions for the operation. Seyfart would be at home with minimal security, and the darkness would provide cover for the assassin's approach and escape. Jan checked his weapon one final time, ensuring that the bullets he had filed so carefully during his training would function flawlessly when the moment came. There would be no opportunity for hesitation or mechanical failure. At precisely 7:30 in the evening, Jan and Castijn approached the front door of Seyfart's residence. The street was quiet, with few pedestrians to witness what was about to unfold. Jan's hand remained steady as he raised it to knock on the door, despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. Years of seminary training had taught him to remain calm under pressure, and that discipline now served him in circumstances the Jesuits had never imagined. General Seyfart answered the door himself, perhaps expecting a routine visitor or administrative matter. Instead, he found himself facing two young men whose calm demeanor gave no hint of their lethal intentions. Jan drew his pistol and fired twice at close range, the shots echoing through the quiet residential street like thunder in a peaceful sanctuary. Seyfart collapsed immediately, mortally wounded but still alive. Jan and Castijn disappeared into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared, following predetermined escape routes that led them through The Hague's maze of streets and canals. Behind them, they left chaos and confusion as neighbors responded to the gunshots and discovered the bleeding general on his doorstep. Seyfart lingered for 24 hours before succumbing to his wounds, providing German authorities with time to organize a massive manhunt for his assassins. The general's death sent shockwaves through both the German administration and Dutch collaboration networks, demonstrating that even high-ranking officials were vulnerable to resistance attack. For CS6, the successful assassination marked their emergence as a lethal force capable of eliminating key figures in the occupation hierarchy. The German response exceeded even CS6's worst expectations. SS General Hans Albin Rauter, the senior German police official in the Netherlands, immediately launched Operation Silbertan, a massive retaliation campaign designed to terrorize the Dutch population into abandoning support for resistance activities. Rauter ordered the immediate execution of 50 Dutch hostages and authorized sweeping raids on universities, where German authorities suspected resistance sympathizers were concentrated. Operation Silbertan represented a fundamental escalation in the brutality of German occupation policies. Previously, German authorities had attempted to maintain at least a facade of legal procedures and proportionate responses to resistance activities. Seyfart's assassination prompted them to abandon these restraints and embrace systematic terror as their primary tool for maintaining control. The civilian casualties from Operation Silbertan created a moral crisis for Jan and his fellow CS6 members. Their successful assassination had achieved its immediate tactical objective, but the cost in innocent lives raised profound questions about the ethics of resistance warfare. Dutch writer A.M. de Jong became one of the most prominent victims when he was executed in October 1943, simply because German authorities suspected him of anti-German sentiments. Despite the terrible repercussions of the Seyfart assassination, CS6 leadership concluded that they had no choice but to continue their campaign against high-ranking collaborators. The success of the operation had demonstrated both their capability and their determination, encouraging other resistance groups while striking fear into the hearts of Dutch citizens considering collaboration with German authorities. Jan's second major assassination target was Volkert Posthume, a former Dutch government minister who had agreed to work with German occupation authorities. Posthume's collaboration was particularly galling because he had once held positions of public trust and responsibility, making his betrayal of Dutch interests especially offensive to resistance members and ordinary citizens alike. The Posthume assassination, carried out in the town of Woerden on June 3, 1943, demonstrated Jan's growing skill and confidence as a professional killer. Unlike the Seyfert operation, which had required careful coordination between two operatives, Jan eliminated Posthume working essentially alone, displaying the kind of cold efficiency that marked truly dangerous assassins. The success of both assassinations established Jan's reputation within resistance circles as one of the most effective and reliable operatives in the Netherlands. German security services began to focus significant resources on identifying and capturing the man responsible for eliminating two of their most important Dutch collaborators. Wanted posters appeared throughout Amsterdam and The Hague, though German authorities still did not know Jan's identity or appearance. October 1943 brought Jan's most audacious operation yet: a raid on the Utrecht police headquarters designed to free two Dutch resistance members who had been captured by German security forces. The operation required CS6 to assault a heavily guarded facility in broad daylight, overpowering professional security personnel and escaping with their prisoners before German reinforcements could arrive. The Utrecht raid succeeded brilliantly, freeing both prisoners and demonstrating CS6's capability to strike at the heart of German security operations. For Jan, the operation represented the culmination of his transformation from rejected seminarian to master of resistance warfare. He had progressed from filing bullets in a basement workshop to leading complex operations that required split-second timing and absolute courage under fire. Yet success brought its own dangers. Each operation increased German determination to capture or kill the members of CS6, and German security services were beginning to piece together intelligence about the organization's structure and membership. The very skills that made Jan so effective as an assassin also made him one of the most wanted men in occupied Europe. As 1943 drew to a close, Jan faced the inevitable consequences of his chosen path. For in the deadly game of resistance warfare, even the most skilled operatives eventually encountered enemies who were equally determined and far more numerous. The network that had protected CS6 for more than 3 years began unraveling in the autumn of 1943, not through German detective work or sophisticated surveillance, but through the oldest weapon in the occupation arsenal: human fear and the terrible choices it forced upon ordinary people. The same emotions that had driven Jan Verleun to resistance would now destroy him, as love, terror, and desperation combined to deliver the most wanted assassin in the Netherlands directly into German hands. Leo Frieda had been one of CS6's most valuable operatives, a skilled forger whose false documents had saved dozens of lives and enabled countless resistance operations. His expertise in creating convincing identification papers made him indispensable to the organization, but it also made him a priority target for German security services who understood that destroying document networks could cripple entire resistance cells. Frieda's personal life had always been a potential vulnerability, though one that CS6 leadership had accepted as manageable. His fiancée was a German Jewish woman who had fled to the Netherlands before the war, seeking refuge from the persecution that was already beginning in Hitler's Germany. Their relationship represented both the international character of anti-Nazi resistance and the complex personal relationships that war and occupation created throughout Europe. The couple's arrest in late October 1943 followed a pattern that had become grimly familiar throughout occupied Europe. German security services, armed with increasingly sophisticated intelligence about resistance networks, moved simultaneously against multiple targets, hoping to capture key operatives before they could warn their colleagues or destroy incriminating evidence. For Frieda's fiancé, arrest meant facing the dual terror of being both a Jew in Nazi custody and a resistance supporter with detailed knowledge of CS6 operations. German interrogators understood exactly how to exploit her situation, offering survival in exchange for information about the organization that had protected her for years. The choice was impossible: betray the people who had risked their lives to save her, or face almost certain death in a concentration camp. Under interrogation techniques that combined psychological pressure with physical brutality, she eventually revealed critical information about CS6's structure and membership. Among the names she provided was Jan Verleun, the quiet young man whose transformation from seminary student to assassin had made him one of the most dangerous enemies of German occupation. The betrayal created a cascading collapse within CS6 as German security services used each piece of new information to generate additional arrests. Members who had operated safely for years suddenly found themselves under surveillance or marked for capture. The careful compartmentalization that had protected the organization proved insufficient against the detailed intelligence that interrogators extracted from captured operatives. November 4, 1943, began as an ordinary day for Jan, who had no indication that his years as a successful resistance operative were about to end. He followed his usual security procedures, varying his route through Amsterdam and checking for surveillance before approaching any sensitive locations. The tradecraft that had kept him alive through dozens of dangerous operations seemed as reliable as ever. The arrest, when it came, demonstrated the overwhelming resources that German security services could deploy when they identified a high-priority target. 10 men surrounded Jan on an Amsterdam street, making resistance impossible and escape unthinkable. These were not ordinary police officers, but members of the Sicherheitsdienst, the Nazi intelligence service that specialized in destroying resistance networks throughout occupied Europe. The arrest team moved with military precision, overwhelming Jan before he could react or alert other CS6 members to the danger. Within minutes, the man who had assassinated two of the Netherlands' most prominent collaborators found himself in German custody, facing interrogators who understood exactly how valuable he was to their efforts to destroy Dutch resistance. Transportation to SD headquarters on Uterpeststraat, now known as Gerrit van der Veenstraat, marked the beginning of what German authorities hoped would be a comprehensive debriefing session that could unravel the entire CS6 network. The building had become synonymous with terror throughout Amsterdam, a place where resistance fighters disappeared and emerged, if at all, as broken shells of their former selves. The interrogation that followed tested every aspect of Jan's character and training. German interrogators combined sophisticated psychological techniques with brutal physical torture, seeking to break down his resistance and extract information about CS6 operations, safe houses, and surviving members. They understood that Jan possessed detailed knowledge about the assassination of Seyfarth and Posthuma, information that could be used to justify massive retaliation against Dutch civilians. Jan's response to torture reflected both his seminary training in spiritual discipline and his years of resistance work under extreme pressure. Despite being handcuffed to his bed to prevent escape or suicide attempts, he maintained a stoic silence that frustrated his interrogators and impressed even hardened SD officers who had broken countless other prisoners. The physical brutality of his treatment was matched by psychological warfare designed to crush his spirit and resolve. Interrogators alternated between promising clemency in exchange for cooperation and threatening to execute his family members if he continued to resist. They displayed photographs of other captured CS6 members, claiming that his colleagues had already betrayed him and that his continued silence served no purpose except to prolong his suffering. Yet even under these extreme conditions, Jan demonstrated remarkable resourcefulness and determination. Despite being constantly monitored and physically restrained, he managed to establish contact with a sympathetic guard who agreed to smuggle a final letter to his family. The letter, written under conditions of unimaginable stress and suffering, revealed both the depth of his faith and his acceptance of the consequences of his chosen path. The letter's most famous passage reflected Jan's ability to maintain his spiritual perspective even while facing certain death. "I was hoping to have a star or two on my collar after the war," he wrote, referring to the military promotions he might have earned in a liberated Netherlands, "but now I will have as many stars as I want." The statement revealed both his acceptance of death and his conviction that his sacrifices would be rewarded in heaven. Even more revealing was his conclusion: "I am going upstairs to be knighted by the Lord of all things, and will have my own star in the sky." These words demonstrated how completely Jan had reconciled his religious faith with his actions as an assassin. The young man who had once been rejected by the seminary had found his own path to serving God, even if that service required taking human life. The letter provided his family with closure, and the Dutch resistance with a powerful symbol of courage under extreme duress. Word of Jan's eloquent final message spread throughout resistance networks, inspiring other operatives and demonstrating that even the most brutal German interrogation techniques could not break the spirit of truly committed resistance fighters. After weeks of futile interrogation, German authorities concluded that Jan would never provide the information they sought. His transfer to the Oranje Hotel prison in Scheveningen marked the beginning of his final journey, from tortured prisoner to condemned man awaiting execution. The prison, officially known as the Deutsches Untersuchungs- und Strafgefängnis, had become the last stop for hundreds of Dutch resistance fighters. The Oranje Hotel's death row, located in the middle cell block known as the D-Gang, housed prisoners who had been sentenced to execution by German military tribunals. These men and women represented the most dangerous enemies of German occupation, individuals whose capture and elimination were considered essential to maintaining Nazi control over the Netherlands. Jan's final night in the Oranje Hotel reflected the spiritual journey that had defined his entire life. The young man who had once knelt in seminary chapels now prepared for death in a prison cell, but his faith remained as strong as ever. He spent his last hours in prayer and reflection, preparing his soul for the judgment he believed awaited him. Prison records and survivor accounts suggest that Jan faced his approaching execution with remarkable calm and dignity. Fellow prisoners reported that he maintained his composure even as guards prepared him for the final journey to the execution grounds at Walsdorfer Vlakte. His behavior inspired other condemned prisoners and demonstrated that the brutality of German occupation had not succeeded in breaking the spirit of Dutch resistance. Dawn broke cold and gray over the Walsdorfer Vlakte on January 7, 1944, casting long shadows across the desolate dunes that had become the Netherlands' most notorious execution ground. At 24 years old, Jan Verleun walked steadily toward his death, flanked by German guards who had conducted this grim ritual hundreds of times before. The young man who had once dreamed of serving God at the altar was about to fulfill his battlefield vow in the most final way possible. The Walsdorfer Vlakte, located near the coastal town of Wassenaar, had been chosen by German authorities specifically for its isolation and symbolic value. The empty dunes provided no cover for rescue attempts, and no witnesses except those the Germans chose to include. More importantly, the location sent a clear message to the Dutch population. Resistance fighters died forgotten and alone, their bodies buried in unmarked graves far from the communities they had sought to protect. German execution protocols at Walsdorfer Vlakte followed military procedures designed to maintain discipline among the firing squad while ensuring the swift completion of their assigned task. Prisoners were positioned against wooden posts driven into the sand, their hands bound behind them and their eyes covered with black cloth. The firing squad, typically composed of 12 men, received orders to aim for the heart, ensuring death would be immediate and certain. Jan's behavior during his final moments reflected the spiritual discipline that had defined his entire life. Witnesses reported that he refused the blindfold traditionally offered to condemned prisoners, choosing instead to face his executioners with open eyes. His calm demeanor and steady voice as he declined the chaplain's final prayers impressed even the German officers supervising the execution. The volley of rifle fire that ended Jan's life echoed across the empty dunes like thunder from a distant storm, marking the conclusion of a journey that had transformed a rejected seminarian into one of the most feared resistance fighters in occupied Europe. His body fell forward into the sand, joining the hundreds of other Dutch patriots who had died at this same spot for the crime of refusing to accept German domination of their homeland. German regulations required immediate burial of executed prisoners in unmarked graves, denying families the comfort of proper funeral rites and preventing execution sites from becoming shrines to resistance martyrs. Jan's body was buried anonymously in the dunes near where he died, with only a numbered wooden marker to indicate the location. The young man who had once hoped to be buried in consecrated ground beside his parish church instead disappeared into the sandy soil of the Walsdorfer Vlakte. The impact of Jan's death extended far beyond the loss of a single resistance operative. German authorities had executed one of CS6's most effective assassins, but they had also created a martyr whose story would inspire other young Dutch men and women to join the resistance. News of his capture, torture, and execution spread throughout resistance networks, along with accounts of his courage under interrogation and his eloquent final letter to his family. Operation Silbertan continued its deadly work throughout 1944, claiming dozens of additional civilian victims as German authorities struggled to suppress Dutch resistance through systematic terror. The death squads organized by SS General Hans Albin Rauter eliminated writers, intellectuals, students, and ordinary citizens suspected of anti-German sentiments. Each execution was designed to remind the Dutch population that resistance activities carried consequences that extended far beyond the actual participants. The systematic destruction of CS6 accelerated after Jan's death, as German security services used information extracted from captured members to identify and eliminate the remaining network. Pam Pooters, the man who had first recruited Jan and provided him with his initial weapon, was executed on October 1, 1943, just months before his protégé followed him to the Walsdorfer Vlakte. The Boissevin brothers, who had founded and led the organization, were eventually captured and executed as well. By the end of 1944, CS6 had effectively ceased to exist as a functioning resistance organization. The group that historian Lo de Jong would later describe as by far the most deadly of the resistance groups had been systematically dismantled by German security services through a combination of betrayal, torture, and execution. Their campaign of targeted assassinations, which had eliminated approximately 20 high-ranking collaborators, had come to an end. The liberation of the Netherlands in May 1945 marked the beginning of a massive effort to account for the thousands of Dutch citizens who had died during the German occupation. Families across the country searched for missing relatives, hoping that loved ones might have survived in hidden prisoner camps or distant concentration facilities. For the Verleun family, the search for Jan's remains became a sacred obligation that would take more than a year to fulfill. The task of identifying and recovering bodies from the Walsdorfer Vlakte proved enormously complex, as German authorities had deliberately obscured the burial sites and destroyed most records of individual executions. Teams of investigators worked methodically through the dunes, using witness accounts and fragmentary German documents to locate graves and identify remains. The process required months of careful excavation and forensic analysis. In 1946, investigators finally located and identified Jan's remains among the hundreds of bodies buried in the execution ground. The discovery allowed his family to provide him with the proper Catholic burial that had been denied by his German executioners. Jan was reinterred in the family grave in Amsterdam, finally receiving the religious ceremony that his parents had always believed he deserved. The post-war period brought both justice and recognition for Jan's sacrifice. Dutch authorities established special courts to prosecute German war criminals and Dutch collaborators who had participated in the occupation administration. Many of the officials responsible for Operation Silbertan and other atrocities faced trial and execution, though some escaped justice by fleeing to South America or other safe havens. The special court system, known as the Bijzondergerechtshof, ultimately tried more than 14,000 cases related to wartime collaboration and treason. 145 defendants received death sentences, though only 42 were actually executed before the Netherlands abolished capital punishment. The trials provided some measure of justice for resistance families, but they could never fully account for the scale of suffering that German occupation had inflicted on Dutch society. Recognition of Jan's heroism came gradually, as Dutch society struggled to understand and commemorate the complex legacy of wartime resistance. The immediate post-war period was marked by conflicting emotions about resistance activities, as some Dutch citizens questioned whether assassination campaigns had been justified given the massive civilian casualties that resulted from German retaliation. The naming of Jan Verleunstraat in Amsterdam represented one of the first official recognitions of his contribution to Dutch freedom. The quiet residential street in the Geuzenveld-Slotermeer district became a permanent reminder of the young man who had sacrificed his life for his country's liberation. Later, historical markers and memorial plaques would provide additional recognition of his service and sacrifice. Modern historical assessment of Jan's life and actions reflects the ongoing complexity of moral questions raised by resistance warfare. His transformation from seminarian to assassin challenges simple narratives about good and evil during wartime, forcing consideration of whether violence can ever be justified in pursuit of righteous goals. The civilian casualties caused by German retaliation complicate any straightforward heroic interpretation of his actions. Contemporary historians generally recognize that Jan and his CS6 colleagues faced impossible choices in an impossible situation. German occupation policies deliberately created moral dilemmas designed to paralyze resistance movements and turn Dutch citizens against each other. The decision to assassinate collaborators represented one response to systematic oppression, though not the only possible response. The debate over Jan's legacy reflects broader questions about the nature of resistance and the price of freedom that continue to resonate in modern conflicts around the world. His story demonstrates both the nobility of individual sacrifice and the terrible complexity of moral choice under extreme circumstances. The young man who had once sought to serve God through prayer and sacrament ultimately served his country through bullets and bombs. Jan Verleun's final letter, with its vision of earning stars in heaven rather than on military collars, provided the most fitting epitaph for his remarkable life. The rejected seminarian had indeed found his calling, though not in the way anyone could have predicted when he first announced his intention to serve God at the age of 9. His transformation from man of peace to resistance assassin demonstrated that the most profound moral journeys often lead through darkness before reaching light. The stars that Jan promised to claim in heaven now shine down on the Netherlands he helped to liberate, marking the eternal rest of a young man who kept his sacred vow to God in the most unexpected way possible.